The white cotton stuck to her back, a second skin of sweat and grime. Clara ran. She ran from the town of penance, from the white-steepled church that cast a shadow long as judgment, from the man who owned the church, owned the town, owned her feet, bare and bloody, found every sharp rock and cactus spine the New Mexico desert had to offer. The Sunday white dress, the one he made her wear for Sabbath meetings, was a ruin. Thorns had ripped the delicate lace at the cuffs. The hem was dark with mud and streaks of her own blood from a fall over an outcrop of shale. It was a suffocating garment, tight in the bodice, designed to remind her of purity, of restriction. Now, it felt like a burial shroud she was forced to wear while still breathing. Behind her, she heard shouting, not close, but not distant enough. Two men, Josiah and Thomas, men from her husband's flock, men who believed Preacher Hale spoke the word of God himself. They would have horses. She had only her own failing legs. Harlot, the word carried on the dry wind, thin and sharp. It was his favorite word for her. He had used it 2 nights ago. His voice not a roar, but a cold, slicing whisper that was far more terrifying. She had dropped a plate. Milk and beans had pooled on the rough floorboards. He had waited, his tall, gaunt frame perfectly still, his eyes black in the lamplight. "Clara," he said, "the name a summons. You invite waste, you invite sin. The Lord abhors a careless woman." She had braced herself, hands tightening on the washboard until her knuckles went white. "It was an accident. Husband, there are no accidents in a righteous house." He countered. He moved then, his hand grasping her arm, fingers digging in like talons. He pulled her not to the bedroom, but to the prayer closet, a space barely wide enough for a man to stand. He pushed her in. "You will contemplate your nature until morning. You will ask God to purge the wickedness from your flesh." The lock clicked. She had spent the night on her knees, the cold seeping into her bones, the smell of dust and old lye filling her lungs. The wickedness he saw was her spirit, the small part of her that still remembered laughter, the part that hated the weight of his hand. Now, running, she stumbled, a sob catching in her throat. The sun was a hammer, beating the high desert into an anvil. There was no shade, only the stunted growth of greasewood and prickly pear. She saw a flicker of movement to her right, a horseman, silhouetted on a low ridge, looking, hunting. She threw herself into a shallow ravine, scraping her palms and knees on the gravel. She lay still, chest heaving, the taste of alkaline dust on her tongue. The fabric of the dress was too white. It gleamed against the brown earth. She frantically grabbed handfuls of dirt and rubbed them over her arms, her chest, her face, trying to blend, to disappear. Josiah's voice again. Closer. "She went this way! Saw the dress!" Clara pushed herself up and ran again, her mind splintering. She was running from the men, from the preacher, from the memory of his sermons. He preached of purity, but his hands were cruel. He spoke of divine love, but his touch was possession. He'd married her when she was 17. A bargain struck between her father and the traveling preacher to save her soul from the vanity of her youth. Her soul was saved, they said, but her body was forfeit. He would punish her for any perceived defiance. A laugh that lingered too long. A question about his scripture. Once, she had tried to sing a song her mother used to hum, a simple tune about a river. He had backhanded her, the force snapping her head back. "Such worldly noise is an invitation to the devil," he'd hissed, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Your voice belongs to God, and to me, I will not have it cheapened." She was a vessel, a tool, a property, and she had defied him. She had run. This time, there would be no prayer closet. This time, the punishment would be final. He had promised as much. "If you ever shame me," he'd warned, his fingers twisting in her hair. "If you ever try to leave the holy covenant of our union, I will bring you back, and I will burn the sin from you. Clara, I will burn it out, layer by layer, until only obedience remains." The terror of that promise gave her a fresh burst of energy. She scrambled up a dry arroyo, the loose rock shifting under her feet. She was not a strong woman, not in the ways of the world. He had kept her weak, fed her barely enough, kept her isolated, but the part of her that wanted to live was a stubborn, wiry thing. She pushed through a thicket of mesquite, the branches tearing at her hair, ripping the pins free until it cascaded down her back in a tangled mat. She did not feel the pain. She felt only the desperate, animal need to escape. The land stretched before her, a vast expanse of cracked earth, red rock, and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. It was beautiful and terrible, an empty canvas that offered no mercy. She did not see the snake. She felt it, a sharp, hot sting on her left ankle, just above the bone. She cried out, a thin, reedy sound, and fell, tumbling down the short embankment. She landed hard. The breath knocked from her. She looked at her ankle. 2 small, dark punctures, already swelling, a faint ooze of blood. A rattlesnake, coiled not 5 feet away, buzzed its warning too late. It slithered away into the rocks, its scales indifferent. Clara stared at the bite. She knew what it meant. She had seen a ranch hand die this way, a slow, agonizing fever, the flesh turning black, the throat swelling shut. The shouting of the men seemed very far away now. A strange, cold calm settled over her. She had failed. She had run from the preacher only to be caught by God himself. Or perhaps this was the preacher's God, the one who saw wickedness in everything, the one who demanded sacrifice. She lay back against the hot gravel, the sun beating on her face. The pain in her ankle was already a dull, throbbing fire, spreading up her calf. Hallucinations began to blur the edges of the canyon. The rocks seemed to ripple and sway. She saw the preacher's face in the clouds, his mouth open in a silent sermon. "So be it," she whispered to the empty sky. She closed her eyes. She was so very tired of fighting. She prayed to die. She prayed for it to be quick. Jack Carver cursed the heat, cursed the deer he was tracking, and cursed the fact that he was out of decent coffee. He was hunkered behind a jut of sandstone, sighting the buck, when he saw the flash of white in the arroyo below. He lowered his rifle. White. Out here. White meant trouble. It meant civilization. It meant people. He had come to these canyons 3 years ago to be shed of all 3. He watched for a long time. It was a person, lying still, a woman, by the looks of the dress. He scanned the ridges. He had heard shouting earlier, distant, like angry crows. Sounded like townsfolk, which was even worse. He debated. Leaving her was the smart play. A woman in a fancy dress, alone in the desert, meant one of 2 things. She was a criminal or she was bait. He had enough trouble of his own. His face, or what was left of it, was a good reminder of what getting involved got you. A shattered jaw and a life spent in exile. All for a railroad baron who paid him to be muscle. He spat the dust from his mouth, but she was lying in a dry wash. If a summer storm came, even miles away, she'd be drowned in a wall of water before she knew it. And then there was the heat. He sighed, a rough, grating sound. He was not a good man. He knew that, but he was not the kind of man to leave a dog to die in the sun. And this was not much different. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and made his way down the treacherous slope, his movements sure-footed and economical. She was worse off than he thought. Barefoot, her feet were a pulp of raw meat. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her lips were cracked and blue. As he got closer, he saw the ankle. It was swollen to twice its size, the skin a mottled purple and green. Snake bite. Bad. He knelt beside her. She was breathing, a shallow, ragged gasp. Her skin was on fire. "Well, hell," he muttered to himself. He looked around again. No one, just the wind and a hawk circling overhead. He hauled her up. She weighed almost nothing. A bundle of sticks and fever. He threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, wincing as his bad knee protested. She moaned, a sound like a small, trapped animal. He carried her the 2 miles back to his cabin, a miserable, squat structure built of stone and mud, tucked into a fold in the canyon walls. It was defensible, and it was hidden. That was all that mattered. He kicked the door open and dumped her unceremoniously on his cot. She did not wake. "Now what?" he grumbled, running a hand through his matted hair. He was damning himself for a fool. This woman was going to die in his bed. And then he'd have to bury her. More trouble. He fetched his knife and the whiskey. He looked at her ankle. It was too late to suck the venom, and that was mostly a fool's errand anyway. All he could do was fight the fever and the poison. He grabbed the knife, a heavy skinning blade, and sliced a crosshatch over the bite. She screamed in her delirium, a high, thin wail that made his teeth ache. He ignored it, pressing the wound to force out as much of the black, venomous blood as he could. Then he poured half a cup of whiskey directly into the cut. She convulsed on the cot, her back arching. He held her down with one hand, his touch heavy, impersonal. He tore a strip from a relatively clean shirt and bound the wound tightly. Then he dealt with the fever. He fetched water from his cistern. It was cool and dark from the earth. He soaked another rag and began to wipe her down, her face, her neck, her arms. That's when he ran into the problem of the dress. The damn thing was stuck to her. Sweat and blood and the ooze from her various scrapes had glued the white cotton to her skin. And it was thick. Layers of it. He tried to unbutton the back, but his fingers were clumsy, and the buttons were tiny. Pearls, for God's sake. He cursed again, louder this time. He couldn't get her cool if she was wrapped in a wool blanket, and this was not much different. He took his knife. He paused. This was a line. He knew, but she was dying. "Forgive me, sister," he grumbled, though he meant the opposite. He hoped she was a prostitute, a criminal, someone who wouldn't make a fuss. He ripped the blade up the seam, from hem to collar. The fabric parted, revealing the plain, sweat-soaked chemise beneath. Even that was stuck. He had to cut it away in pieces, peeling it from her skin like a rind. She was all angles and bruises. Ribs stood out like a washboard. There were old scars on her back, pale and crisscrossed, that looked like they'd come from a whip or a belt. He stopped. His gut tightened. He knew those marks. He'd seen them on soldiers who'd been flogged, on slaves in the South. This woman wasn't a criminal. She was a runaway. He threw the ruined dress into a corner. It landed in a heap, a sullied white patch against the dirt floor. He finished cleaning her, his touch now a fraction gentler, his movements efficient. He found an old, long john shirt of his and wrestled her into it. It swallowed her whole. He sat by the cot for a long time, watching the fever ride her. She thrashed, muttering words he couldn't catch. "No," she said once, clear as a bell. "Please, no more." Jack Carver felt a cold, familiar anger settle in his stomach. He looked at the woman on his cot, a stranger, and felt nothing but a profound desire to be alone again. He had saved her. Now he was tied to her. He was a fool. Clara woke to the smell of wood smoke and old coffee. Her body ached in a way that felt deep and permanent. Her ankle was a universe of pain, a hot, heavy star dragging her back into the dark. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was not her own. It was low, made of rough-hewn beams and mud. A single, small window let in a sliver of dusty light. She was not in the prayer closet. She was not in the arroyo. She tried to sit up, and a wave of dizziness slammed her back down. She was weak, weaker than she had ever been. A man sat in a chair across the small room, his back to her. He was cleaning a rifle. The rhythmic shk-shk of the cleaning rod the only sound. He was a big man, his shoulders broad under a worn brown shirt. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her throat. A bounty hunter, an outlaw. One of her husband's men, tracking her in secret. She tried to move, to scramble away, but she was tangled in a heavy wool blanket. She looked down at herself. She was wearing a man's red flannel shirt. Her dress was gone. A small, terrified sound escaped her. The man stopped cleaning the rifle. He did not turn. He simply sat, perfectly still. The silence stretched, heavy and menacing. Slowly, As if he had all the time in the world, he put the cleaning rod down and stood. He turned to face her. Clara's breath caught. His face, one side was normal, rough stubbled, a strong jaw, a piercing blue eye. The other side was a ruin. A puckered, angry scar ran from his temple down his cheek, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent, grim half-sneer. He looked like a man who had seen hell, and hell had decided to leave its mark. He said nothing. He just looked at her with that one good eye. "Where?" she managed, her voice a dry croak. "Where is my dress?" Jack Carver picked up a tin cup from the small table. He walked to the stove, dipped the cup into a pot of water, and walked to her bedside. He held it out. He did not look her in the eye. He looked at a spot on the wall just above her head. She shrank from him, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She flinched, expecting the cup to be thrown, expecting a hand to strike. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Drink, or you'll die. And I didn't haul you 2 miles just to dig a hole." His hand remained steady. She stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was not her husband. He was something else, something wilder, more dangerous. But he was offering her water, hesitantly, her hand shaking. She reached out from under the blanket and took the cup. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was calloused and hot. She flinched again, pulling her hand back as if burned. He stepped back immediately, retreating to the other side of the room, putting the rifle between them. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. Clara drank. The water was lukewarm, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She drained the cup, her hand still trembling. The dress was ruined. He said to the wall, "Stuck to you. Had to cut it off. The snake bite." She looked at her ankle. It was wrapped in a clean, white bandage. She remembered the sting, the fall. You found me. In the arroyo. You're lucky it wasn't a sidewinder." He did not sound pleased about her luck. He sounded annoyed. She was a burden. She knew this tone. She had been a burden her whole life. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Jack. Just Jack." Are you one of his men?" He finally looked at her. His gaze was cold, assessing. "I ain't one of nobody's men, especially not his, whoever he is." He gestured to her bandaged ankle. "You were running. Judging by the marks on your back, you had good reason to—" Clara's hand flew to her own back, a protective, useless gesture. Shame washed over her, hot and acrid. He had seen her. He had seen her shame. "You're a prostitute," he stated. It was not a question. "Or a thief." "I am not," she said, a spark of her old fire returning. I was a wife." He snorted, a humorless sound. "Worse, a wife. No wonder you were running. What'd you do, poison him?" "I ran," she cried, the word tearing from her raw throat. "I just ran." He studied her for a long moment. "Well, you ran here, and now you're here. You can stay till you can walk. Then you move on. I don't want no trouble." He turned his back to her, picked up his rifle, and walked to a heavy wooden cabinet in the corner. He unlocked it, placed the rifle inside, and locked it again. He pocketed the key. Clara watched him. He was locking his guns away. Was it to protect them from her, or to protect her from him? He slept on the floor that night, by the door, rolled in a blanket, his hat over his face. Clara lay awake, listening to the cabin breathe. She listened to the sound of his breathing, steady and deep, and she listened to the world outside. The New Mexico landscape was not silent. Coyotes yelped in the distance, a sound of wild, lonely hunger that echoed in her own chest. The wind soughed through the canyon, a low, mournful sound. Later, a dust storm blew in, sand and grit rattling against the single window like tiny, insistent fingers trying to get in. She did not sleep. She found a small paring knife he had left near the dry sink, a knife he had used to cut carrots for a stew she could smell. She slipped it under the thin mattress of the cot. He was an outlaw, a bounty hunter, a killer. He had a face from a nightmare. He had cut her clothes from her body. but he had locked his guns away, and he had given her water. As she recovered, the silence in the tiny cabin became a living thing. It was a thick, heavy blanket, layered with suspicion and unspoken questions. Days bled into one another, marked only by the square of light moving across the floor. He would leave in the mornings, his rifle in hand, and be gone for hours. He always left a bucket of water and some hardtack or jerky by her cot. When he returned, he would set a rabbit or a brace of quail by the door, clean them with ruthless efficiency, and cook a stew in the black iron pot. He rarely spoke. "Eat," he would command, shoving a bowl of broth at her. "Thank you," she would whisper. He would grunt and turn away. She watched him. He was meticulous. He kept his small space clean. He mended his own clothes with thick, clumsy stitches. He never looked directly at her. If he had to hand her something, he would set it down and step back, avoiding her gaze, his body angled away from her. She, in turn, flinched every time he moved too suddenly. When he had to change the bandage on her ankle, she would lie rigid, her hands fisting the blanket, her eyes screwed shut, bracing for a pain that was not the bite. He was not gentle, but he was not cruel. His hands were rough, his touch impersonal, brief. He did his work and retreated. They were two animals trapped in a small cage, circling each other, waiting for the first sign of aggression. The dust storms raged outside, trapping them together, forcing a proximity that was almost unbearable. The coyotes howled, and in the small, dark cabin, Clara and Jack sat in the suffocating silence, each nursing their own wounds, each hiding their own knives. The fever broke on the 9th day. Clara woke feeling scoured, hollowed out, but blessedly clear. The throb in her ankle had receded to a dull, manageable ache. She was alive, and the realization landed on her not as a joy, but as a problem. To be alive meant she had to do something next. She sat up, this time without the room spinning. The red flannel shirt she wore was rough against her skin, rank with the smell of old sweat, wood smoke, and man. It fell to her knees, a shoddy, giant's dress. Jack was outside. She could hear the rhythmic thwack of an axe biting into dry wood. She stood, testing her leg. It held, though barely. She limped to the open doorway, bracing herself on the frame. He was in the small, sun-baked patch of dirt he called a yard, his back to her. His shirt was off, plastered to his waist, and the muscles in his back coiled and released with every swing. He was a man of brutal, simple purpose. Chop wood, haul water, track game, survive. She watched him for a long time, until her leg began to tremble. She needed clothes. She could not, would not, continue to exist in this cabin as a bed-bound invalid in his shirt. She was a person, not a piece of salvage. When he finally stopped, wiping his face on the shirt from his waist, he turned and saw her. He froze. His one good eye narrowed. He was not used to her being upright. He was not used to her being in the doorway, watching him. "You're up," he said. It was not a question. "I need my dress," Clara said, her voice stronger than she expected. He looked at the axe in his hand, then back at her. He said nothing. He walked past her into the cabin, forcing her to stumble back from the doorway. He went to the corner where he had thrown the wadded-up, ruined garment. He kicked it with his boot. "That?" he asked. Clara limped over. She looked down at the muddy, torn, blood-stiffened white cotton. The tiny pearl buttons were mostly gone. The lace was a cobweb of grime. It was the uniform of her imprisonment, the symbol of her shame, the shroud she had almost been buried in. She stared at it, and a cold, final hatred rose in her. It's ruined," she whispered, not in sadness, but in dawning recognition. "I told you I had to cut it," he said, already turning away, his duty done. "No," she said, "it was ruined before that." He paused, glancing back at her, his expression unreadable. "I need something," she said, gesturing to the flannel shirt. "I cannot stay in this, and I cannot wear that." Jack stared at her for a beat. He seemed to be measuring a problem. He went to a small wooden trunk at the foot of his own bedroll, unlatched it, and pulled something out. He threw it on the cot. It was another shirt, smaller than the red one, made of blue chambray, worn thin at the elbows but clean, and a pair of canvas trousers, stained with old grease, but also clean. "They won't fit," he grumbled. "But they're all I got, unless you want to sew up that white mess." She looked at the shirt and trousers, then at him. He was offering her his own clothes. Not a dress, not a replacement for what she was. Something else entirely. "Thank you," she said. He grunted and walked back outside, picking up his axe as he went. Clara waited until the sound of chopping resumed. She picked up the blue shirt. It smelled like lye soap and sun. She pulled the heavy red flannel off, her skin prickling in the cool air of the cabin. She stood naked for a long moment, a pale, thin creature of bruises and angles. Then she pulled the blue shirt over her head. It was soft. It was light. It hung on her, but it felt clean. The trousers were hopeless, built for a man's hips and legs. But she rolled the cuffs and cinched the waist tight with a short length of rope he used for bundling hides. She walked to the small, cracked piece of mirror he had nailed by the door for shaving. She looked at herself. A small woman with a tangled mess of brown hair was staring back. Her face was gaunt, her eyes too big, but she was not wearing white. She was not bound in a bodice. She was wearing a man's shirt, her collar open at the throat, her feet bare on the dirt floor. She did not look like Preacher Hale's wife. She did not look like the harlot he'd screamed at. She looked like someone else, someone she had not met yet. A small, strange, powerful feeling uncoiled in her chest. It was not joy. It was not hope. It was something drier and tougher. It was the feeling of a slate wiped clean. Something had broken, and it had set her free. When Jack came back in for water, she was sweeping the floor. He stopped dead. The cabin was tiny, and she was in his way, wielding the crude broom he'd made of desert willow. She was clumsy, favoring her ankle, but she was sweeping. She flinched when she saw him, clutching the broom like a weapon. They stood there, the silence drawing tight. "Get off your foot," he said, his voice rough. "It's healing," she replied, her chin held high. "It needs to heal faster. I will not be a burden." "You're a burden whether you're sweeping or not," he said, but he didn't sound angry. He just sounded tired. He moved past her to the water bucket. She did not stop. The next day, she found his mending kit, the one with the thick, clumsy needles and sinew thread. The curtains over the one window were ripped, letting in streams of dust. She sat on the cot, her back to him, and began to stitch them. Her mother had taught her fine needlework, a skill the preacher had deemed frivolous, but her fingers remembered. The stitches were small, neat, perfect. Jack sat at his small table, cleaning his rifle, the shik-shik sound filling the room. He did not look at her, but he saw the way her fingers moved. He saw the patch of sunlight on her bent head. He saw the neat, tight line of thread she was laying down. It was not the clumsy work of a camp woman. It was the work of a lady, or someone who used to be. It made him uneasy. A few days later, he came back from his traps to find the cabin filled with the smell of stew. Not his stew, which was a bland, functional affair of boiled meat and water. This smelled of wild onion, sage, and thyme. She was standing at the stove, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. She had found his stash of dried herbs. She looked up, her face flushed from the heat. Strands of hair stuck to her damp forehead. I found the rabbit you left. I hope this is all right." He said nothing. He just took the bowl she offered. The stew was hot. It was rich. It was the best damn thing he had tasted in 3 years. He ate it all, his back to her. When he was done, he put the bowl in the wash basin. "It's all right," he said. And he went outside to check on things that didn't need checking. She began to claim small spaces in the cabin. She washed her new shirt and his, hanging them on a line near the fire. She organized his scattered tins of beans and coffee. She chopped wood, though she was terrible at it, the axe handle too big for her hands. He watched her struggle for 10 minutes, his jaw tight, before he snatched the axe from her. "You'll take your own foot off," he snarled. "Then I'll be a burden again," she retorted, her eyes flashing. He stared at her, surprised by the fire. He split the rest of the wood in a flurry of angry, precise blows, then stacked it himself. But the next day, he left a smaller hatchet by the wood pile. He said nothing about it. She said nothing either, but she used it. He said little, but he noticed everything. He noticed she no longer flinched every time he walked into the cabin. He noticed she was starting to put weight on her bad ankle. He noticed the bruises on her arms were fading from purple to a sick, faint yellow. And he noticed, with a deep and unsettling part of his brain, that the blue shirt fit her better than it had any right to. The nights were the hardest. The fire would be banked, the small cabin sinking into a darkness so thick it felt like velvet. He lay on his bedroll by the door, she on the cot. The space between them was only a few feet, but it was a chasm. He could hear her breathe. He could hear her turn, the cot ropes creaking. One night, the coyotes were particularly loud, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. The sound was lonely, and it got inside her. "Jack," she said, her voice small in the darkness. He was awake. He was always awake. "What? Why did you bring me here?" He was silent for a long time. "You were dying. You could have left me. I ain't a good man, Clara, but I ain't that man. What kind of man are you?" He rolled onto his back, staring up at the dark ceiling. "The kind that wants to be left alone." She was quiet. Then, her voice, even smaller. Are you waiting for me to be better? Are you going to try to use me, like the others?" The question hung in the air, blunt and heavy and terrible. It was the question that had been living under the floorboards of the cabin since she'd arrived. Jack closed his eyes. He thought of the whores in Kansas, the ones who smelled of cheap perfume and desperation. He thought of the things men did when they thought no one was looking. "No," he said. His voice was flat, final. "I ain't." The air was still heavy. It was heavy with the things he did not say. That he was a man and she was a woman. That they were alone. That her hair smelled like wood smoke when she walked past him. That he had not been touched by another human being with anything but violence in 5 years. He heard her let out a breath. A long, shuddering sigh, as if she had been holding it for a week. My husband," she said, her voice gaining a strange, brittle strength from the confession. "He married me when I was 17. My father gave me to him, a gift, to tame. He said I was too flighty." Jack said nothing, but he was listening. "He never let me read anything but the Bible. He said other books were full of worldly sin. He said singing was a harlot's cry. He said laughing too loud was an invitation to the devil. He hurt me when I defied, when I was not pure enough in my thoughts." She paused, and he could hear the tremor in her breath. "I tried to leave once before. Last spring, I only got as far as the edge of town. He and his men, they dragged me back. He whipped me, in the church meeting, in front of everyone, to show them what happens to a defiant wife, to purge the sin." Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew those scars. He had known what they were the moment he saw them. "That's when I knew," she whispered, her voice breaking, "that I had to run, or I had to die. So I ran." The silence that followed was different. It was not his silence, or her silence. It was theirs. It was a shared, grieving, angry thing. He sat up. The moonlight from the small window was just enough to cast his shadow on the wall. A big, hunched shape. "He ain't your husband anymore," Jack said. "He is, in the eyes of God and the law." "Then God and the law are fools," he growled. She watched his shadow. "What about you, Jack? What brought you out here, to this edge of the world?" He wanted to tell her to be quiet. He wanted to tell her it was none of her business. His past was a locked box, buried deep. But she had shown him hers. The law of the desert was about trading, water for jerky, a life for a secret. "I was a scout," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For the Union. In the war. I was good at finding things and killing men." He stood up and walked to the dying fire, kicking at the embers. They sparked, briefly illuminating the ruin of his face. "After the war, there ain't much call for a man like me, except for other men who need killing done. Worked for the rail barons, clearing, obstacles, landowners, grangers, anyone who got in the way of the track." He poked the fire with a stick, his movements jerky, angry. "It was good money. For a while. Till I got tired of it. Till I realized I was just a gun for rich men. I tried to quit, in Kansas. My employer, he didn't like that. Said I knew too much. He and his boys. They cornered me in a saloon." He turned, and the firelight caught the scar. "This," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "is what getting paid by the railroad gets you. They shot me in the face and left me for dead in a pigsty." He laughed, a dry, barking sound that was more pain than humor. "I guess they figured I wouldn't smile much after that. They were right." He stood there, a big, broken man, silhouetted against the glowing embers. Clara sat up on the cot. She looked at him. She saw the man who had terrified her, the man with the ruined face and the cold eyes. But she saw, for the first time, the man who had been shot and left for dead, the man who had been used, just as she had. She got off the cot, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. She walked toward him. He tensed. He saw her coming, a pale shape in the blue shirt. He expected her to go for the water, or the door. He did not expect her to stop, right in front of him. She looked up at his face, not at his good eye, at the scar, at the puckered, mangled flesh that ran from his temple to his lip. She looked at it with an intensity that made him want to bolt. He was waiting for the flinch, the gasp, the look of revulsion. It never came. She raised her hand, slowly, so he could see it. He could have stopped her. He could have grabbed her wrist or stepped back. He did neither. He stood frozen. His breath caught in his chest. Her fingertips, calloused from the axe handle but still so light, touched the ridge of his scar, just above his jawline. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Her touch was not one of pity. It was not one of disgust. It was curious, clinical, as if she were mapping a territory. Jack's entire body went rigid. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot through him, starting from the point of her touch and spreading down his spine. It had been so long. So long. He wanted to pull away. He wanted to fall into her. He almost pulled back, but he didn't. He stood. He let her. He let her touch the ugliest, most broken part of him. She traced the line of the scar down to the corner of his pulled-up mouth. Her finger was trembling. Or maybe he was. "He didn't stop you from smiling," she whispered, her voice rough. "He just made it mean more." She dropped her hand, but she did not step back. They stood in the firelight, so close, breathing the same air. The tension, the thing that had been unspoken, was suddenly a roar in the small room. It was Jack who broke the spell. He stepped back, a harsh, sudden movement. "Go to bed, Clara," he said. His voice choked. "The fire's out." He turned his back on her, walked to his bedroll, and lay down, facing the door. She returned to her cot, her hand tingling. She slid under the blanket, but she did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the sound of his breathing, fast and uneven. Life in the cabin continued, but everything had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was charged with the things they had said and the things they had not. Clara watched him when he mended the fence on his small, doomed patch of a corral. She watched the sun on his back, the effortless strength as he lifted the heavy posts. It was not a strength she feared anymore. It was just his. He watched her. One afternoon, he came back from checking his snares, moving silently as he always did. She was in the yard, his hatchet in her hand, but she was not chopping wood. She was dancing. There was no music. She was barefoot, her eyes closed, turning slowly in the red dust. Her arms held out. A small, secret smile was on her face. She was humming a tune he couldn't catch, a ghost of a song. She was not the preacher's wife. She was not the half-dead creature he'd found in the arroyo. She was Clara, and she was, for a moment, completely, beautifully free. He stood in the shadows of the canyon wall, his heart doing a slow, heavy thump in his chest. He watched her for a full minute, a strange, protective ache rising in him. He felt like an intruder. He made a small sound, scuffing his boot, and she froze. Her eyes flew open, the smile vanishing. A blush crept up her neck. I was just, she stammered, dropping the hatchet. Don't, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Don't stop. But the moment was broken. She fled into the cabin, and he was left staring at the empty patch of dust, the ghost of her song in his ears. The desert sky, which had been a merciless, clear blue for weeks, began to turn. One evening, the air grew thick, heavy, and yellow. The wind died, and a strange, oppressive silence fell over the canyon. Storm's coming, Jack said, his eyes on the horizon. A bad one. He spent the next hour securing the cabin. He barred the window shutter, reinforced the door, and checked the roof. Clara brought his horse, a skittish mare, into the small, lean-to stable attached to the cabin wall. It hit just after dark. The wind came first, a low, rising howl that turned into a shriek. Then the rain, not a gentle fall, but a hard, horizontal lashing that sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the walls. And then the lightning. It was not a storm. It was a war. The sky was split open, again and again, by jagged cracks of white-hot light, followed by claps of thunder so loud the cabin walls shook. Clara was huddled on her cot, the blanket pulled up to her chin. She was terrified of lightning. The preacher had told her it was God's anger, his finger pointing out the wicked. Jack sat at his table, oiling a handgun by the light of a single, flickering lantern. He seemed completely unbothered. Then a crack, not a rumble, but a sharp, deafening explosion, as if the sky had shattered directly over their heads. It was followed by the sound of a great tree splitting and crashing nearby. Clara screamed. It was not a small cry of fright. It was a raw, terrified scream, torn from the deepest part of her. She screamed and scrambled off the cot, falling to her knees in the middle of the floor. No, 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 please, I'll be good. Please don't burn me, please. She was not in the cabin. She was in the past. She was in the church, or the closet, or running from the men. Jack was on his feet in an instant. The gun was on the table. He crossed the few feet between them and knelt in front of her. Clara, he said, his voice sharp. Clara, it's the storm. It's just the storm. She didn't hear him. She was rocking back and forth, her hands over her head, her body shaking violently. I'll be good. I'll be quiet. Please, husband. No, no more. He put his hands on her shoulders. She shrieked and recoiled, striking out at him, her hands weak but desperate. Don't touch me. Clara, it's Jack. You're in the cabin. You're safe. He grabbed her wrists, holding them firm. Look at me. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, glazed with terror. Look at me, he yelled, giving her a small, hard shake. Her eyes focused. She blinked. The terror was still there. But now, confusion. Jack, it's just the storm, he said, his voice softer, but still firm. He did not let go of her wrists. Lightning hit the old cottonwood on the ridge. That's all. You're safe. She stared at him. The thunder rumbled again, but further away. The rain was still lashing the roof. She was trembling from head to foot. She looked down at his hands, big and dark, wrapped around her own thin wrists. He was holding her. He was holding her. And she was not fighting. The terror receded, and a great, shuddering wave of exhaustion and cold washed over her. She collapsed forward, her forehead slumping against his chest. Jack froze. She was holding on to him. Her hands, no longer fighting, were clutching the front of his shirt. He could feel her shaking, feel the dampness of her tears soaking through the fabric. His arms, awkwardly, came up. He didn't know what to do. He had held men while they died. He had held women, but always with a purpose, a payment. He had never just held someone. Tentatively, he put one hand on her back, between her shoulder blades. He could feel the frail bones. He put the other hand on the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her soft, messy hair. He just held her. On the dirt floor of a mud cabin, in the middle of a thunderstorm, he held her. She did not push him away. She did not recoil. She pressed herself closer, burying her face in his chest, and cried. She cried for her lost youth, for the preacher's cruelty, for the snakebite, for the fear. She cried for all the nights she had been alone and terrified. And he held her. He said nothing. He just held on, his hand on her head, his other hand on her back, anchoring her. He was a solid, warm, unmoving thing in a world that had come apart. They stayed like that for a long time. The storm moved on, the thunder fading to a distant grumble. The rain softened to a steady, drumming rhythm on the roof. The only sounds in the cabin were her quiet, hitching sobs and the steady, solid beat of his heart under her ear. Finally, her sobs quieted. She was just breathing, her body heavy against his. She stirred, as if waking up. I'm sorry, she mumbled into his shirt. Nothing to be sorry for, he rumbled, his voice thick. She did not move away, and he did not let go. They were close, closer than they had been, closer than he had been to anyone in a lifetime. He could smell her hair. It smelled like rain and soap. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his chest. He looked down at the top of her head, at the tangle of her hair. The kiss. It was right there. It was a breath away. All he had to do was tilt her chin up. Her lips were parted. She was warm and soft against him. The night, the storm, the shared confessions. It was all leading to this. He wanted to... God, he wanted to. He wanted to taste something other than dust and whiskey. But he didn't. This was not a choice. This was comfort. This was fear. And he had told her he would not use her. A kiss now, born of a nightmare, would be just that. It would be a lie. He slowly, carefully, loosened his grip. "Storm's passin'," he said. She heard the shift in his tone. She pulled back, her hands still resting on his chest. Her face was a mess, streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes red and swollen. But she looked at him, really looked at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. He helped her to her feet, his hands on her elbows, steadying her. They stood, an arm's length apart. The air between them was electric. The tension was back, but it was different. It was not just suspicion. It was not just awareness. It was a new, fragile, terrifying thing. It was a promise. "Go to bed," he said, his voice hoarse. "Get some sleep." She nodded. She went to her cot, pulled the blanket around her, and turned her face to the wall. Jack sat at his table for the rest of the night, watching the lantern burn down, the unloaded gun in his hands. He did not sleep. The kiss had not come, but it was close. It was sitting on the table between them, as real and as dangerous as the loaded gun. The storm passed, but it left the air charged. The intimacy of that night, of Jack holding her while she broke, had woven a new, invisible thread between them. It was taut, and it was fragile. When he told her he was riding to town for supplies, the thread pulled so tight she thought it would snap. "Town?" she repeated, her voice thin. She was standing by the stove, holding a tin cup of coffee. "Out of flour," he said, not looking at her. He was checking the cinch on his saddle, his movements short, efficient. "And salt, and coffee's low." I can go," she offered, though her ankle was still a tender, swollen mess. He stopped. He finally looked at her. His good eye was flat. "No, you can't. You can't even walk to the spring without a limp. You ain't ready for town." A cold fear, sharper than any she'd felt during the storm, gripped her. He was leaving. He was leaving her alone. After she had cried on him, shown him her weakest, most broken self. He was disgusted. He was leaving for good. "You're coming back," she said. It was not a question. It was a plea. He paused, his hand on the saddle horn. He looked at her, at the panic in her wide eyes, the blue chambray shirt that was still too big for her. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve, or a trap he'd already stepped in. "I live here, Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I'm coming back." Or worse. The thought hit her as he mounted his mare. He was going to town. He would talk to people. He would hear something, or he would see a sheriff, a lawman. He would tell them about the woman he'd found. A woman with whip scars on her back. A woman running. He could trade her. A woman for a winter's worth of supplies. The fear must have shown on her face. He scowled, the scar on his jaw tightening. "Bar the door. Don't go outside. Don't light a fire till dark. And don't talk to no one." He nudged the mare and rode out of the yard without a backward glance. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him go. She watched until his broad-shouldered shape was just a speck against the red rock, until the sound of his horse's hooves faded to nothing. The silence of the canyon rushed in. It was a different silence than before. It was not the peace of isolation. It was the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a held breath. She barred the door. She spent the day in a fever of anxiety. Every gust of wind was a horseman. Every skitter of a lizard on the roof was a boot step. She scrubbed the floor until her knees were raw. She mended a tear in his other shirt. Her stitches as small and perfect as she could make them, a desperate, superstitious offering. "Please come back. Please be alone." She was terrified he would not return. She realized with a cold, sickening lurch, even more terrified that he would not be alone. Redemption Creek was a 40-mile ride, a full day's journey. It was a hard, sun-scorched town of 20 buildings, half of them saloons, all of them looking temporary. Jack hated it. He hated the smell of unwashed bodies, stale beer, and civility. He tied his mare outside the general store, his rifle in his hand. He never left his rifle. His face, as always, earned him a wide berth. Men looked at him, then looked away. The scar was a warning, a do not speak sign written in damaged flesh. He bought his flour, his salt, his coffee, and a small bag of hard candy, which he told himself was for him. He paid in cash, his words clipped. The storekeeper, a man with nervous eyes, bagged his goods without a word of small talk. He had one last stop. He needed cartridges for his rifle, and he needed a drink, one drink, to wash the taste of the ride and the town out of his mouth. He pushed open the bat-wing doors of the Lucky Spur. It was early, the saloon dim and smelling of sour mop water. 2 men were at a corner table, nursing beers, a freight driver and a local ranch hand by the looks of them. Jack went to the bar, put his back to the wall, and ordered a whiskey. He drank it slowly, letting the burn settle. He was just about to leave when he caught the words. "Swear on my mother's grave," the ranch hand was saying, his voice carrying in the empty room. $50. Preacher Hale, over in Penance. He posted it himself. Jack's hand tightened on his glass. He did not move. He did not turn. He was a stone wall. $50 for what? The freight driver asked, spitting tobacco juice onto the floor. "A horse, a woman," the ranch hand said, and he laughed. "His wife. Can you believe it? Run off. Took a horse and a pile of his church money, so he says." "A wife?" The driver sounded intrigued. "What's she look like?" "Hell if I know. But the poster says she's a wicked woman, a harlot who corrupted the household and run off with a hired hand. But the hand's been found. Beat to hell. Says she ran off into the desert alone. Preacher wants her back. Says he needs to save her soul from damnation. $50. The driver mused. "A man could ride a long way for $50. "I'm telling you," the ranch hand said. "It's easy money. A runaway woman in that white dress. She can't have got far, probably dead of thirst by now. Or maybe found, some folks would call it salvation. Jack put his empty glass on the bar. He put a coin down next to it. He walked out of the saloon. He did not run. He did not look at the men. His blood was a cold, slow river of ice. He bought his cartridges and rode out of town. He rode hard, pushing the mare. His mind a cauldron of cold fury. He was angry. He was furious at the preacher, at the men in the saloon, at a world that put a price on a woman's head. And he was angry at Clara. She had lied to him, or at least she hadn't told him. She had let him tend to her, let him feed her, let him hold her. She had let him feel whatever it was he was feeling, all while she was a $50 bounty, all while she was, in the eyes of the law, a thief. What else had she lied about? The whipping, the husband. Maybe she had poisoned him. Maybe she was a harlot. The 40-mile ride back took half the night, but he barely noticed. The anger was a hot coal in his gut, burning away his weariness. He saw the faint, flickering light of the cabin from a mile away. She had lit the lamp, a beacon, or a target. He rode into the yard and just sat there, the mare breathing hard under him. He looked at the cabin. It had been his sanctuary, his exile. Now, it was just a place with a price on its head. The door opened. She stood in the rectangle of yellow light. She was wearing his blue shirt, her hair pulled back, her face pale and strained in the gloom. She was holding a tin cup. "I made coffee," she said, her voice trembling. He said nothing. He swung down from the horse, his body stiff. He pulled the heavy sacks from the mare's back, his movements jerky, violent. He threw the flour and salt on the small porch, the sacks landing with a heavy, final thud. He brushed past her into the cabin, pulling the door shut behind him. The silence was terrible. It was worse than the storm, worse than the days of mutual suspicion. This was a new, cold, dangerous silence. He stood in the middle of the room, his back to her, his shoulders a wall of rigid anger. "Jack," she whispered. "What is it? What's wrong?" He turned, slowly. His face, in the lamplight, was the face of the man she had first feared. The scar was a livid shadow, his good eye a chip of ice. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked. His voice was not a yell. It was a low, deadly rumble. Tell you what? That you're a thief, that you corrupted a household, that you're a runaway wife with a $50 bounty on your head. The color drained from her face. She looked, for a second, like he had shot her. She staggered back, one hand finding the edge of the table to steady herself. How did you... Town, he spat. "Men talk. Seems Preacher Hale is mighty keen to get his property back, so keen he's offering money for it." She stared at him, her mouth open, but no sound came out. "So, what's the truth?" "Clara," he snarled, advancing on her. She shrank back. "Was it the money? Did you steal from him? Is that why you're really running? Was any of it true? The whip? The closet? Or was that just a story? A good story to tell a fool in a canyon to keep him from turning you in?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes wide with a new, different terror. Not of him, of his words. "No, it's true. All of it." "So you didn't steal his money?" "No, I took nothing. I ran. I ran in my dress. I had nothing." He was close now, looming over her. Then why the bounty? Why corrupted a household? Why thief? "Because," she said, her voice breaking. "Because he would. He would say that, because he cannot have a wife just leave. She must be a sinner. She must be a criminal. If I am a thief, then he is just, if I am just, a woman who ran, then he... She couldn't finish. She looked at his cold, angry face, and the last of her strength, the strength that had held her up for 3 weeks, just evaporated. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just deflated. Her legs gave out and she slid to the floor, her back against the table leg. She sat there, a small, huddled shape in his blue shirt, and covered her face with her hands. It was not a loud breakdown. It was a quiet, profound, and terrible surrender. A single, dry sob shook her. "Even out here," she whispered into her hands. "Even all this way, he won't leave me alone. He will never, ever leave me alone." Jack stood over her, his fists clenched, his anger warring with something else. This was not the confession of a liar. This was not the fear of a thief. This was the exhaustion of a hunted animal. This was the sound of a woman who had finally, completely run out of road. His anger did not vanish, but it shifted. It turned from her and pointed back out, into the dark, toward Penance, toward Preacher Hale. He let out a long breath. He knelt, not close, just down on her level. "He ain't found you," he said, his voice quiet now. The anger banked. "He will," she muffled. "He'll send men. He'll come. He'll find me. And he'll find you. And he'll hurt you for helping me." "Let him try," Jack said. She looked up then, her face streaked with tears, her eyes pleading. You should take me back. Jack, take me to him." "Get the $50. At least you'd be safe." He stared at her. He stared at her for a long, long time. And then he did something he had not done in years. He almost smiled. The scar pulled at his lip, but the expression in his good eye was something else. "Get up, Clara," he said, and his voice was not hard, and it was not soft. It was just his. "The coffee's getting cold." They ate supper in silence, but it was the silence of their first days, a shared space, a guarded truce. He was no longer angry. He was thinking. She was no longer terrified. She was numb. Night fell. The rituals of the cabin took over. He banked the fire. He checked the bar on the door. He unrolled his bedroll. He was about to lie down, in his usual spot, a guardian by the threshold. "Jack." Her voice was a thread in the dark. He stopped, his back to her. "Don't." He paused. "Please," she said, her voice stronger, but trembling. "Don't sleep on the floor. Not tonight." He tensed. He misunderstood. He turned, his face a shadow. "Clara, I told you, I ain't that man." "I know," she said, and he could hear the desperation in her voice. "I know you're not. I'm not asking for that." She sat up on the cot. He could just see her outline in the faint moonlight from the window. I'm so tired, and I'm so scared. I know he's coming. I know it. And tonight, I don't want to be alone. Please." She was asking for comfort, not for sex. She was asking for the man who had held her in the storm. He stood by his bedroll for a full minute. The chasm of the cabin floor, only 10 feet, seemed a mile wide. To cross it was to change everything. To cross it was to admit that he was not just her protector. He was something else. Slowly, as if walking on thin ice, he walked to the cot. It was small, built for one. He did not take off his boots. He did not get under the blanket. He just lay down on top of it, on his back, his hands folded on his chest. He was a mountain of a man next to her small form. She was on her side, under the blanket, facing him. They were inches apart. He could feel the heat of her, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and woman. They lay in the dark. The only sound was the cabin settling, the pop of the cooling stove, and the sound of 2 people breathing. The silence grew, but it was not an empty silence. It was full. It was charged with a tenderness so profound it was almost painful. It was the most intimate either of them had been in their entire lives. After a long, long time, her hand moved. It crept out from under the blanket, a small, pale shape in the dark. It trembled. It moved until her fingertips, just the very tips, brushed the back of his hand. His hand was huge, calloused, scarred from work and violence. Hers was small, fine-boned. A jolt, like a low current of electricity, passed between them. He did not pull away. He did not turn his hand to take hers. He just let them touch fingertips, a fragile, tentative bridge. The silence stretched, and it became a comfort. "I want to remember," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost just a breath. He turned his head on the rough pillow. "Remember what?" "What it's like," she whispered, and he could hear the tears in her voice. "To be touched and not hurt. I think I've forgotten. He made me forget what a hand feels like. Unless it was to punish her vulnerability, her broken, whispered confession. It undid him. It broke through the wall he had built around himself. The wall of anger, of exile, of ugliness. He moved. Slowly. He rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow, looking down at her. His shadow fell across her face. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, luminous in the dark, tears silvering her lashes. She was not afraid. She was just waiting. He leaned down. His scarred face, the ruin of his past, was close to hers. He did not kiss her mouth. That was a claim. That was a possession. He didn't know how to do that, not in a way that was clean. Instead, he lowered his head, breathing in the scent of her hair, and pressed his lips to the side of her neck, just above her collarbone. He felt her pulse, fluttering like a trapped bird. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of reverence. It was an oath. It was a promise that his touch would not be a hurt. She let out a sound, a small, shuddering sigh, and her hand, the one that had been touching his fingertips, moved. Her fingers slid into his, and she held on. He pulled back, just enough to see her face. She was watching him, her eyes full of a raw, fragile, terrifying trust. A trust he knew he did not deserve, but one he would. He realized. Kill to protect. She reached up her other hand, the free one, and laid it on his scarred jaw, the same place she had touched by the fire. This time, it was not curiosity. It was an invitation, a permission, a plea. He leaned in again, and this time, she met him halfway. He kissed her neck again, and her hand in his tightened, slowly, with a trembling reverence that was almost a prayer. They began to undress each other. It was not a seduction. It was a liberation. His rough fingers were clumsy on the small buttons of her chemise. She helped him, her own hands shaking as she unladed his belt. He pulled his shirt over his head, and she laid her palms flat on his chest, tracing the old, pale scars there, maps of a life he'd never spoken of. Every touch was a question. Every answering touch was a yes. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, clad in only her thin chemise, when he saw it, in the wooden trunk at the foot of the cot, where she must have put it, the wadded heap of white cotton, her old life, her prison. He stopped. He stood up, naked to the waist, and walked to the trunk. He pulled the dress out. He held it up in the moonlight that streamed through the window. It was a ghost. It smelled of her fear, of dust, of the preacher's righteous anger. Clara watched him, her breath catching. She did not know what he was doing. He looked from the dress, a symbol of her bondage, to her, the woman in the thin chemise who had asked to remember touch, his face, in the shadows, set in a hard, resolute line. He walked to the cast-iron stove. He opened the firebox door. The embers from their supper fire were still glowing, a bed of dull red. With a sudden, violent motion, he ripped the dress. The sound of tearing cotton was a scream in the quiet cabin. He ripped it again, and again, tearing the lace, the tight bodice, the mud-stained hem. He tore it into strips. Then, he shoved the pieces, one by one, into the stove. He added a small piece of kindling. The dry fabric caught. The flames flared up, a sudden, bright orange that illuminated the entire cabin, that danced on his scarred face and her tear-streaked one. Clara watched, and the tears that had been threatening all night, all week, all her life, finally came. They were not tears of fear or of pain. They were tears of release. She watched her old life, her shame, her prison, turn to ash. He turned back to her, the firelight casting flickering. heroic shadows across his bare chest. He walked to the cot. He knelt on the floor in front of her. He did not speak. He just gently, so gently, wiped the tears from her cheeks with his rough thumbs. He kissed her mouth, softly. A question. She kissed him back. Her hands found his face. A yes. Their first night together was not a fire. It was not a storm. It was a quiet, trembling discovery. It was the feeling of skin on skin, a language they were both learning for the first time. Every touch was a healing. Every caress was an unspoken promise. He was not just a man, and she was not just a woman. They were two survivors, and in the small, dark cabin, with the smell of burning cotton in the air and the flames of her past dying in the stove, they found a way to be free. The morning after, the cabin was transformed. The silence was no longer a weapon, not a space of suspicion, but a soft, shared blanket. It was a peace so profound it was almost shocking. Clara woke first, curled on her side, Jack's heavy arm thrown protectively over her waist. He was still asleep, his scarred face relaxed in a way she had never seen. The grim line of his mouth softened. She lay still, watching him, her heart doing a slow, heavy beat that was part fear, part wonder. This was real. This man, this scarred stranger who had saved her, was now hers. They lived, for a brief time, in a kind of stolen grace. The canyon, once her prison, became a world. The rituals of survival became the rituals of a life together. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy, unspoken rhythm. He would rise before dawn to hunt or check his snares. She would have coffee boiling on the stove when he returned, his presence filling the cabin with the sharp, clean smells of sagebrush and cold morning air. But Jack knew this peace was fragile. The $50 bounty was still out there. The preacher was still out there. "You need to learn," he said one morning, his voice abrupt. He was standing in the doorway, the sun at his back. Clara looked up from the beans she was sorting. "Learn what?" "This," he said. He stepped inside and laid his heavy rifle on the table. She recoiled, her hands flying to her chest. "No, I can't. I've never—" Preacher Hales said. He said guns were instruments of damnation, for men's hands only. "The preacher ain't here," Jack said, his voice flat. "And he ain't wrong about one thing. It's an instrument. And out here, it's the only one that sings a song anyone listens to. I can't be here every second. You ain't gonna be a victim again, not while I'm breathing. You're gonna learn." He took her out to a shallow box canyon 1/2 mile from the cabin. He set up an old tin can on a rock, 100 feet away. The rifle was heavy in her arms, shockingly so. It felt wrong, cold and hard and full of death. "It's just a tool, Clara," he said, his voice quiet, standing behind her. He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder. His hands were on her, guiding her, his touch firm and impersonal. But she could feel the warmth of his body through her shirt. "It's steadying. Don't fight it. Make it part of you. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. And breathe out when you do." She was terrified. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a roar that shook her to her bones. The rifle kicked like a mule, slamming into her shoulder and knocking her back a step. She cried out, dropping the gun in the dust. Her shoulder was on fire. "I can't," she said, tears of fright and pain stinging her eyes. "I can't, Jack." "You can," he said. He picked up the rifle, brushed the dust from it. "You flinched. You closed your eyes. You can't hit what you can't see. Look at it. Look at the can. That's all there is. Just you and the rifle and the can." He stood behind her again. "Tuck it in. Tighter. That's right. I got you." He put his hand on her shoulder, bracing her. "Now. Look. Squeeze." She kept her eyes open. The metal can wavered at the end of the barrel. She breathed out. She squeezed. The crack was just as loud, the kick just as hard, but this time she was ready. A puff of dust exploded from the rock, just to the left of the can. "Better," he grunted. "Again." They spent all morning, She fired until her shoulder was a purple, swelling bruise, until her ears rang, until her arms ached so badly she could barely lift the rifle. But she stopped flinching. She learned to breathe, and just before noon, a glorious ringing ping echoed through the canyon as the can flew off the rock. She gasped, lowering the rifle. She had done it. Again, he said. But she could see, just at the corner of his good eye, a crinkle of approval. He taught her to ride, too. Not the timid, side-saddle posture the preacher had demanded, but how to ride like a man, astride, with her legs. He taught her how to feel the mare beneath her, how to anticipate its movements, how to become part of its strength. It was another kind of liberation. The horse, the rifle. He was giving her the tools of his own survival. He was giving her the world. Their connection deepened, becoming something more than shared survival. The nights were where it truly settled. The awkwardness was gone. The terror of her past was still there, a shadow in the corner, but it no longer had power over her. She was bold. She was hungry. She had been starved for a lifetime, not just of food, but of joy, of touch, of simple, honest affection. And now, she was feasting. She was the one who initiated. She would walk up behind him while he was cleaning his guns by the fire, her bare feet silent on the floor, and wrap her arms around his waist, pressing her face into the solid wall of his back. He would freeze every time, as if he still couldn't believe it, as if he was waiting for the trick. Then, slowly, his hands would cover hers. "You're real," she would whisper, just to feel him breathe. "So are you." He would rumble. She explored him, his body, his face. She learned the map of him. One night, lying by the fire, she traced the scar on his jaw, no longer with pity, but with a fierce, possessive tenderness. "This is yours," she murmured. "This is part of the man who found me." Jack was undone by her. He was a man who had been paid for his capacity for violence, a man who had hidden his face from the world, a man who believed himself to be unlovable. And this woman, this fragile, broken bird, trusted him. She touched him with a reverence that he felt in his bones. She looked at him not as if he were a monster, but as if he were a refuge. He was careful. He was so careful with her, as if she were spun glass. He had seen what cruel, clumsy hands had done to her. His hands, though rough and scarred, were agonizingly gentle. He was responsive to her every touch, her every sigh, letting her lead, letting her rediscover her own body, her own desire. In a place where she was finally safe, he was, for the first time in his life, overcome by the sheer, terrifying weight of being trusted. He started to imagine things. He, a man who had not dared to look past the next sunrise, began to imagine next year. They were sitting outside one evening, watching the sky bleed purple and orange over the canyon rim. The air was cool, the silence comfortable. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet. He was whittling a piece of willow. "This canyon, it's a good place to hide, but it ain't a place to live." Clara looked at him, her heart catching. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we can't stay here forever. Not really. It's a hole." He looked out at the vast, empty landscape. "I've been thinking about north, Wyoming, maybe Montana. I heard there's land, good land, grass up to your waist, rivers so cold they make your teeth ache. A man could start a small ranch, run a few head of cattle." He looked at her, his good eye searching her face. "Together," he said, just the one word. Clara stared at him. A future, a home, a life. Together. It was a concept so foreign, so vast, she couldn't breathe. She had spent her entire life trying to survive the day. He was offering her tomorrows, all of them. "A ranch," she whispered. "Just a small one?" He said quickly, as if afraid she'd laugh. "Just for us." She said nothing. She just moved across the small space between them, sat at his feet, and laid her head on his knee. He stopped whittling. His hand, hesitant, came to rest on her hair. A future. With this new, fragile hope came a new voice. When Jack had returned from town, he had brought not just flour and coffee, but a small, leather-bound notebook and a pencil. He had left them on the table without a word. Clara had claimed it as her own. She began to write. She hid the notebook under her mattress, the same place she had once hidden a knife. She wrote at night, by the fire, when Jack was outside, or in the sliver of daylight that came through the window. She did not write prayers. She did not copy scripture. She wrote her own story. She wrote about the preacher, his cold hands, his sermons on sin. She wrote about the prayer closet, about the whipping, about the suffocating white dress. She wrote about the snake bite, and the terror, and the feeling of praying for death. And then she wrote about Jack. She wrote about his scarred face and his quiet anger. She wrote about the stew he made, the way he locked his guns away, the day he taught her to shoot. She wrote about the storm and the way he held her. She wrote about the fire and the burning dress and what it felt like to be touched and not hurt. She was, at last, writing her own testimony. She was taking her life back, one word at a time. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days had begun to blur into a happy, seamless rhythm. Jack had gone out to check his perimeter, a habit he'd taken up since his trip to town. He no longer just hunted. He patrolled. He was gone longer than usual. Clara was kneading dough for bread, humming the tune she had danced to. When he returned, he did not walk in. He stood in the doorway, blocking the light. His face was the mask of cold stone she remembered from their first days. "What is it?" she asked, her hands freezing in the dough. "Jack, you're frightening me." "Pack," he said, his voice flat, dead. "Just the water, the jerky, and the ammunition. Nothing else. We're leaving." "Leaving? Leaving where? What happened?" "He found tracks," Jack said. "3 riders, less than a mile from the spring. They're good. They're casing the canyon." The blood drained from Clara's face. The bowl of dough slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. No, it could be anyone. Ranchers, prospectors." "They ain't prospectors," he said, walking into the room. He began to check his rifle, his movements swift and economical. "They're moving in a triangle. They're hunters, and they ain't found us by accident." Clara's mind flew to her journal, her hope, the ranch. "Jack, get the supplies. Clara, we ride north, now. We can be out of the canyon before they know we've moved." She just stood there, paralyzed by the sudden, cold dread. He was coming. After all this, he was here. It got worse. 2 days later, Jack, who had been sleeping in fits, his rifle next to his bedroll, found it. He had sent Clara to the spring, telling her to be fast, to stay low. She came back not with water, but with a scream frozen on her face. She was pale, shaking, her hands empty. "Clara, what is it? Where's the bucket?" She couldn't speak. She just pointed. He grabbed his rifle and ran, pulling her behind him. "Stay here," he ordered, shoving her behind a cluster of boulders. He crept forward, his body low, his eyes scanning every shadow. He saw it on the old cottonwood tree, the one that marked the path to the spring. Something glinted in the morning light. He got closer. His blood ran cold. It was a wedding band, a simple, thin band of gold. It was nailed to the tree trunk, hammered in with a single, crude iron nail, right at eye level, where she could not miss it. It was Clara's ring, the one she had told him she'd thrown in the dirt of her room before she ran. He had found it. The preacher had found the ring, and he had carried it all this way. He had ridden into this canyon, past Jack's defenses, and he had nailed it to this tree. It was not just a threat. It was a sermon. It was a brand. It was a cold, patient, terrifying promise. "You are mine. I am here. You cannot run from God, and you cannot run from me." Jack ripped the ring from the tree, the nail screeching as it came free. He stalked back to Clara. He opened his hand. The ring and the nail lay in his palm. She made a small, choked sound and fell back against the rock. "He was here," she whispered. "He was right here, while we were sleeping. He's toying with us, Jack said, his voice a low, lethal growl. He was not afraid. He was furious. The sheer arrogance of it, the violation. "We have to run," Clara said, scrambling to her feet. Her voice was thin, frantic. "Now, Jack, we have to go. We'll ride all night. We'll go north, just like you said. We can—" "No." The word stopped her cold. "What?" "We're done running," Jack said. He looked at the nail in his hand. "He thinks he can walk in here, nail his claim to my tree. He thinks he can just walk in and take you." "He will," she cried, the terror finally breaking her. "You don't understand him. He's not just a man. Jack, he's a zealot. He believes God is on his side. He will bring men. He'll bring the law. He'll tell them you kidnapped me. He'll see you hanged. He will kill you just for helping me." "Let him try," Jack said. He turned and started walking back to the cabin. "Jack, no!" She ran after him, grabbing his arm. "Please, don't do this. It's me he wants. It's my sin. I brought this to you. I brought this danger. If you hadn't found me, you'd be safe." The guilt, the old shame the preacher had branded on her, poured out. "It's my fault. I'm a stain. I'm a wicked woman, just like he said. I corrupted you." He whirled on her, his face a thunderhead. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging in. "Stop it," he commanded. "You stop that, right now. You are not a stain. You are not wicked. You are a woman who survived. You are the strongest person I have ever known. And this is not your fault. It is his." He stared at her, his good eye burning with a fire she had never seen. "I spent my whole life running. Clara, from the war, from the railroad, from my own face. I'm done. I ain't running from this two-bit Bible thumper. He ain't taking you." His voice softened. "Just a fraction. You deserve someone who won't just hide you in a hole. You deserve someone who will stand up, someone who will fight for you." She looked at him, at this brave, foolish, broken man who was willing to stand against God and the law, all for her. The love she felt for him was a sudden, agonizing wave that stole her breath. He was right. Running wouldn't work. The preacher would hunt them until they were old, or until he was dead. The only way out was through. Her fear did not vanish. It crystallized. It turned into a hard, cold, defiant anger that matched his. She was not the preacher's wife. She was not a victim. She was Jack's woman, and she would not be taken. She reached up and put her hands on his face, her palms covering his rough cheeks, her thumbs on his scar. Her hands were trembling. "Then don't just fight," she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate command. He looked at her, confused. "Clara, don't just fight for me," she said, her eyes locked on his, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce need. "Take me, now. Remind me what you're fighting for. Remind me what's real, before he comes." He understood. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the need to claim their life, their bond, before the outside world came to tear it apart. This was not a plea for comfort. This was an act of war. He swept her up into his arms, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was not gentle, not healing. It was desperate. It was fierce. It was almost angry. It was a claiming. He carried her into the cabin, kicking the door shut. He did not take her to the cot. He took her to the middle of the floor, in the patch of sunlight, on the bearskin rug where they ate, where they lived. They tore at each other's clothes, their hands frantic. This was not the slow, healing discovery of their first night. This was a desperate, primal need to hold on. It was a defiant act against the man who had nailed her past to a tree. It was skin on skin, teeth and nails, a fierce, raw, almost violent staking of a claim. It was their way of holding on to each other before the storm broke, their way of saying, in the only language they had left, that this was real, and they would not let it go. The first sound was not a gunshot. It was a voice. It came from the canyon rim, amplified by the high rock walls, a sound that did not belong in the wilderness. It was a voice of iron and judgment, a voice that carried like a sermon. "The wicked woman shall be brought low." Jack and Clara, entangled on the bearskin rug, their bodies still damp from their desperate union, froze. The air in the cabin turned to ice. That voice, it was a sound from Clara's nightmares, a sound she thought she would never hear again. He's here," she breathed, her voice paralyzed, her hands flying to her throat. Jack was moving before she finished the sentence. He was a coil of sudden, lethal energy. He was off the floor, his trousers pulled on, his gun belt strapped around his waist in 2 swift motions. He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, animal growl. "Stay away from the window." "Clara!" The voice boomed again. Closer. "You have defiled the covenant. You have wallowed in the sty of your own sin, but the shepherd has come for his lost, his wicked, his sullied lamb." Jack peered through a crack in the window shutter. On the ridge, not 300 yards away, sat 3 men on horseback. The one in the center was tall and gaunt, dressed in black, his face a pale mask of righteous fury. Preacher Hale. The other 2 were rough-looking men, hired guns, both with rifles resting easy in their arms. "He brought men," Jack said, his voice flat. "2 of them." "He will kill you," Clara whispered, her body shaking so violently she could barely stand. She was pulling her shirt on, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. "Jack, he will kill you, and he will drag me back." "He ain't taking you," Jack said. He kicked the cabin door open and stepped onto the porch. He did not hide. He stood in the full morning light, his rifle held in one hand, his scarred face turned up toward the ridge. "That's far enough. Preacher!" Jack's voice was not a yell, but a deep roar that seemed to rise from the canyon floor itself. Preacher Hale's horse took a few steps down the trail. He raised one hand, as if delivering a benediction. "I have not come for you, broken man. I have come for what is mine. I have come for my wife, stolen from my home by a thief and a leper." "She ain't your wife," Jack called back. "And she ain't stolen. She's free." "Free?" Hale's laugh was a dry, terrible sound. "The harlot is never free. She is a slave to her own flesh. You have stolen the sacred vessel of my house, and you will answer for it. You will burn for this." "She ain't going anywhere," Jack said. "Ride on, or I'll send you to meet your God myself." "Blasphemy!" Hale roared, his face purpling. He had not expected this. He had expected a cowering thief, not a defiant guardian. "You will release her to me, or you will be struck down. I am here on the Lord's business." "Then the Lord's business is about to get bloody." Jack said, "Last chance. Preacher, ride out." Hale's face twisted. He gave a sharp, almost invisible nod to the man on his right. The world exploded. The crack of the hired man's rifle echoed, and the bullet thudded into the door frame next to Jack's head, sending splinters into his cheek. Jack did not flinch. He was already moving, diving from the porch, rolling behind the low stone wall of the corral. He brought his own rifle up. He was not a barroom brawler. He was a scout. He was a hunter. He fired. One shot. The man who had fired on him gave a choked, surprised grunt. He dropped his rifle, clutched his chest, and toppled sideways from his horse, crashing into the rocks below. He did not move again. "No!" Clara screamed from the cabin doorway. Get back inside," Jack roared at her. The second gunman, startled, fired wildly. His shots chipped the stone wall, kicking up dust. Jack was already moving, using the meager cover of the corral, his eyes sighting down the barrel. This was his canyon. He knew every rock, every shadow. He aimed. Not for the chest, for the arm. He squeezed the trigger. The second man cried out. A high, thin sound, as the rifle was torn from his grasp. He clutched his shattered right shoulder, blood pouring between his fingers, and wheeled his horse around in a panic. It had taken less than 10 seconds. One man dead, one wounded and fleeing back up the trail. And then there was Hale. The preacher sat on his horse, stunned, his escorts, his righteous fury, had dissolved into blood and cowardice. He looked at the man he had killed, then at the man fleeing, and then his eyes, black with a terrible, unholy rage, fixed on the cabin. On her. "Devil!" he screamed, his voice cracking. He spurred his horse, not in retreat, but in attack, charging down the slope toward the cabin, toward Clara, who was still frozen in the doorway. He was pulling a heavy revolver from his belt. Jack saw it. He raised his rifle, but Hale was moving fast, and Clara was in the way. "Clara, move!" he yelled. But Clara did not move. She did not hide. She did not run. Something inside her, the last thin thread of her old fear, finally snapped. She stepped out. She walked away from the cabin, away from Jack's protection, and stood in the middle of the yard, her feet planted in the red dust. She was wearing his blue shirt. Her hair was a wild tangle, and her face was pale, but her eyes were on fire. She stood, unarmed, and waited for her husband. Hale yanked his horse to a stop, 10 feet in front of her. The animal reared, its eyes wild. Hale's face was a mask of utter hatred. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "Harlot," he hissed, his voice venomous. "Look at you, filthy!" Dressed as a man, you would stand with this stain against your own husband. "He is not my husband," Clara said, and her own voice shocked her. It was clear. It was cold. It was not the voice of his victim. "I am your husband," he shrieked, raising the revolver, though he did not point it at her. Not yet. "I am your master. In the eyes of God, you are a vessel of sin. You are a devil sent to tempt me. You are a stain on my name, on my church." "I am not a stain," Clara said, her voice rising, gaining strength from the dry, clear air. "I am not a harlot, and I am not a devil." She took a step toward him. "I am a woman you tried to kill. I am a woman you beat, and you starved, and you locked in the dark, and I am done." She raised her chin. Her eyes locked on his. "I would rather be a harlot in this canyon," she said, her voice ringing with a terrible, final clarity. "I would rather be a stain on the rocks. I would rather be the devil himself than be yours." His face, for a moment, went blank with shock. She had never spoken to him like this. She had never defied him. She had rejected his sermons, his power, his very world. His control snapped. The righteousness fell away, leaving only the raw, ugly violence beneath. "Then I will send you to hell," he roared. He did not shoot her. He meant to strike her, to beat her into submission as he always had. He raised his arm, the heavy revolver in his fist, to bring it crashing down on her skull. The rifle cracked. It was Jack. He had moved from the corral, his face a mask of cold fury. He had not shot to kill. He had shot to punish. The bullet struck Hale's right shoulder, the same one the other man had favored. The impact spun the preacher clean out of his saddle. He landed hard in the dust, the revolver flying from his numb hand. He screamed. It was not a roar of anger. It was a high, thin animal sound of pain and disbelief. He lay on the ground, clutching his ruined shoulder, his black suit covered in the red dust. He looked at Jack, then at Clara, his eyes wide with a new, terrified understanding. They were not his victims. They were his judgment. He was left moaning, a pathetic, broken man, his righteousness shattered, his power bleeding into the dirt. Jack did not spare him a second glance. He ran to Clara, who was standing, trembling, in the aftermath. He grabbed her arm. "Now," he said. "Now we go." The cabin?" she stammered, looking back at their home. "It's gone," he said, pulling her toward the horses. "It's just a place. He knows it. They all know it. We're done here." They did not pack. They had already prepared. The saddlebags with the water, the jerky, the ammunition, and her hidden journal were already on the mare. He grabbed the reins of both horses, helped her mount, and swung up onto his own. They rode out of the yard, past the dead man, past the moaning, defeated preacher. Clara did not look back. They rode north, out of the canyon, pushing the horses hard. They rode into the harsh, unforgiving high desert, the land they had crossed to find each other, now the land they had to cross to escape. They rode for hours, until the canyon was just a scar on the horizon. The sun was a hammer, beating down on them. The silence was broken only by the clatter of hooves on stone and their own ragged breathing. Late in the afternoon, Jack faltered. He swayed in the saddle. "Jack!" Clara called, pulling her horse alongside his. He was pale, his face slick with a sweat that was not from the heat. He looked down at his left side, just above his hip. His shirt was dark, soaked with a color that was not dust. "He got me," he grumbled, his voice thick. "That second one, the one who ran, his shot was wild, but not wild enough." "Dear God," she whispered, "we have to stop. I have to bandage it." "No," he said, setting his jaw. "We stop. They catch us." Hale won't be down for long. He's got a wounded man, and he's got a horse. He'll ride back to Penance and get a posse. He'll claim we're murderers. We have to keep moving. He spurred his horse, but his movements were getting clumsy. They rode on, into the twilight, into the dark. The landscape was a gray, featureless nightmare. That night, the sky broke, the temperature plummeted, and the rain came. Not a gentle rain, but a cold, driving, brutal downpour that turned the dust to mud and soaked them to the bone in minutes. It was a blessing and a curse. It would wash away their tracks, but it was freezing. They found a shallow overhang of rock, barely enough to shelter them from the worst of the wind. They were shivering, their teeth chattering. Clara helped Jack down from his horse. He almost collapsed, his weight falling entirely on her. I have to see the wound," she insisted, her voice shaking with cold and fear. By the light of a single, shielded match, she pulled up his shirt. It was a deep, ugly graze. A bullet had torn a channel of flesh along his ribs. It was bleeding sluggishly, but the flesh was already looking angry. It's bad," she said, her voice small. "It ain't in me," he grunted, though his face was gray with pain. "It's just flesh. Tie it tight." She tore a strip from her own chemise, the last piece of her old life, and packed the wound as best she could, her hands clumsy with cold. She wrapped the bandage tight, her own tears mixing with the rain on her face. He slumped against the rock, and she huddled against him, her arms around him, trying to share her meager body heat. They sat like that all night, shivering, listening to the rain lash the desert. And then the coyotes came. They did not come close, but they were there, a pack drawn by the scent of blood. They yelped and howled from the darkness, a ring of unseen, hungry voices. It was a high, lonely, terrifying sound, the sound of the wilderness waiting to claim them. Clara held Jack tighter. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, his body burning with fever one moment, shivering with cold the next. "It's just dogs," he muttered, his hand weakly finding his pistol. They won't come close. Fire's what we need." But they had no dry wood. There was no fire. There was only the rain, the blood, and the howling. They rode for 3 more days. It was a blur of misery. The rain stopped, and the sun returned, baking the mud into a hard pan. Jack was feverish, delirious. He swayed in the saddle, and Clara had to tie his wrist to the saddle horn to keep him from falling. She led his horse, her own body screaming with exhaustion. She measured their life in sips of water from the canteen. The jerky was gone. They were running on nothing but her will. She did not know where they were going. She just rode north, as he had said, north. On the 4th day, just as she was sure they were both going to die, that she would fall from her horse and the coyotes would finally have them, she saw it. It was not a city. It was just a town, a small, quiet collection of buildings nestled in a cottonwood grove. Smoke rose from a chimney. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She half-dragged, half-carried Jack from his horse. He was a dead weight, his feet dragging in the dust, his head lolling on his shoulder. He was muttering, something about the railroad, about Kansas. She kicked open the door of the first building she saw that looked like it offered shelter. A small, hand-painted sign read, "The Silverlode Inn." The room was warm, clean, and smelled of baking bread. An older woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes as sharp and clear as a winter sky, looked up from the desk. Clara, her clothes in tatters, her face streaked with mud and tears, her hair a matted wreck, stood in the doorway, holding up the weight of a bleeding, half-conscious, heavily armed man. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, my husband, he's been hurt. He needs a doctor." The innkeeper looked at them. She did not look at the mud. She did not look at the gun. She looked at Clara's hands, raw and bleeding from the rains. She looked at the gold wedding band that was not on her finger. She looked at the desperate, fierce, protective terror in Clara's eyes. She looked at Jack, at the ruin of his face, at the dried blood on his shirt, at the way his hand was still, even in delirium, gripping Clara's arm. The widow saw the truth. She saw the flight, the fight, the desperation. She saw two people who had been through a war. She did not ask a single question. She did not ask for money. She did not ask their names. She simply rounded the desk, her face softening just a fraction. "He needs a bed," the widow said, her voice firm but kind. "Bring him in. Room 2, on the left. I'll fetch the doctor. And some broth. You both look like you're about to fall over." She held the door open for them. She was taking them in. The fever held Jack in its grip for 4 days. A burning, restless torment. Clara never left his side. She sat in the small, clean room at the Silverlode Inn, a room that felt as foreign as a palace, and she fought for him. She spooned broth given to her by the inn's owner, the quiet, stern widow named Agnes, between his cracked lips. She kept the bandages clean, washing them herself in the basin, her hands stinging from the lye soap. She bathed his face, his scarred, familiar face, with cool water, whispering to him when he thrashed in his delirium. "It's all right, Jack," she would murmur, her hand steady on his forehead. "You're safe. I'm here. It's just the fever." "You're safe." She was no longer his patient. She was his anchor. She tended to him with a fierce, protective focus that left no room for her own exhaustion. The doctor, a weary man with kind eyes, had come and stitched the wound, declaring it clean but deep. "He's strong," the doctor told Clara, his eyes assessing her own gaunt frame. "But the fever will decide. You rest too, ma'am. You look like a ghost." But Clara could not rest. She watched the man who had pulled her from the arroyo, the man who had held her in the storm, the man who had stood between her and her husband's rage, and she willed him to live. She poured her own stubborn survival into him. On the 5th morning, his eyes opened, and they were clear. He looked at her, his gaze sharp, focused. He was weak, but he was Jack. "Clara," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. She burst into tears, a sudden, silent flood of relief that soaked the front of her filthy shirt. She just nodded, unable to speak, her hands gripping his. "You're safe," he muttered, his eyes closing again. But this time, it was the pull of healing sleep, not the void of fever. As he recovered, the quiet rhythm of their life returned. But it was different. It was softer. They were no longer in the harsh, red rock world of the canyon. They were in a room with 4 walls, a clean floor, and a window that looked out onto a quiet street. Widow Agnes brought them meals. Simple, hearty food. She never asked their story. She just accepted Clara's claim. "Your husband is looking better today, Mrs. Carver," she would say, and the new name, his name, settled around Clara like a warm, protective cloak. Jack was a terrible patient. He hated being weak. By the 2nd week, he was sitting up, his face grim, his side a band of fire. But he was alive. Clara, in that time, began to mend herself. She had no clothes but the torn, blood-stained blue shirt and canvas trousers she had fled in. Widow Agnes gave her a simple, gray work dress, one of her own, and Clara wore it with gratitude. But it was not hers. She began to help the widow, sweeping the inn's floors, peeling potatoes in the kitchen, hanging linens on the line. Agnes paid her a few coins, which Clara accepted without shame. She was earning her keep with her first few coins. She did not buy food. She went to the general store across the street. She spent a long time touching the bolts of fabric. There was a white lawn, delicate as a moth's wing. She flinched from it. There was a dark, severe black, the color of her husband's suit. She moved on. She chose a blue, not a pale, washed-out chambray, but a deep, strong calico, the color of a mountain shadow, with a tiny, stubborn pattern of yellow flowers. It was the color of strength, the color of the sky before a storm. She bought the fabric and a spool of thread and a set of new needles. She sat in the chair by the window in their room while Jack dozed or just watched her, and she began to sew. She sewed a new dress. There was no pattern. She cut it based on the memory of her own body, a body she was finally reclaiming. It was not a preacher's wife's dress. The collar was simple, the waist was high and comfortable, the sleeves easy to move in. It was a dress for a woman who worked, a woman who lived, as she stitched, her small, neat stitches mirroring the ones she had used on the cabin curtains. She felt as if she were sewing her own skin back together. This was not for a husband. This was not for purity. This was for Clara. While she sewed, they talked. Their voices were low, the plans quiet, as if speaking them too loudly would break the spell of their safety. "The money's almost gone," Jack said one afternoon. He had a small pouch of coins he'd taken from his cabin, money from his last foray as a railroad man. It was nearly empty. "I can work," Clara said, not looking up from her seam. "I am Widow Agnes. She's fair." "We can't stay here," he said. He was right. This town was a respite, not a home. The preacher was still out there. The bounty was still out there. "We have to go north. Like I said, Wyoming." "Wyoming," she repeated. The name felt good on her tongue. It sounded clean. "With the cattle." "A few head," he said, and she heard the faint, hopeful smile in his voice. "A small brand, a new name, a name that fits." "Carver," she said, testing it. "Mrs. Carver. I like the sound of it." He looked at her, his face serious. "We'd have to make it legal. Find a preacher, a different kind of preacher." Clara's hand stilled on the blue fabric. "Yes, we would." They were planning a future, a clean slate. It was no longer a desperate dream. It was a plan, quiet and solid, stitched together in a small room, in a small town that had taken them in. But the past was not yet finished with them. A man arrived on the stagecoach, a man with a stiff collar and a leather satchel. He was a traveling lawyer, a circuit judge, taking depositions and filing claims. He sat up in the inn's small dining room. Clara saw him, and a cold, hard resolve settled in her. She had her testimony. She had the leather-bound book, still safe in her saddlebag. It was her word against her husband's. She waited until Jack was asleep. She took the journal, her hands trembling. She walked into the dining room. The lawyer, Mr. Elias Thorne, looked up, his spectacles perched on his nose. "Yes, ma'am? Can I help you? My name," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "is Clara Hale. My husband is Preacher Josiah Hale of Penance." The lawyer's eyebrows rose. He knew the name. The preacher was a man of influence in the territory. I have a testimony," she said. She placed the journal on the table. I am not a harlot. I am not a thief. I am a runaway wife. My husband, he tried to kill me. He is a man of violence. This book, this is my story. It is the truth." Mr. Thorne looked at her earnest, bruised face, at the simple, mended dress she wore. He opened the book. He read a page, then another. He read of the prayer closet, of the whipping, of the terror. He was silent for a long time. Finally, he looked up, his face grim. "Ma'am, this is a terrible account. But a wife's testimony against her husband, it is not easily given. I know, she said, but he has put a bounty on my head. He has called me a criminal. He will hunt me. This is all I have. It is my voice. I want you to send it east. To the newspapers, to the marshals, to anyone who will listen. I am not a criminal. I am a survivor. Let the world know his truth. Mr. Thorne closed the book. He looked at her with a new respect. It will be a hard fight. Mrs. Hale, his word against yours. My name, she said, her chin high, is Clara Carver, and I am not afraid of him anymore. The final test came 3 days later. It was just after noon. Clara was sweeping the inn's porch. Jack was sitting in a chair against the wall, his first time out in the sun, his face pale but his jaw set. A rider came down the street. He was not a cowboy. He was wearing a new duster, and he had a tin star pinned to his vest. He was a lawman, and he was not the local sheriff. He pulled his horse up in front of the inn. He looked at Clara, then at Jack, his eyes lingering on Jack's scarred face and the pistol at his hip. He swung down from his horse. Afternoon, ma'am, he said. He was a big man, but he looked tired. I'm Sheriff Brody, from Penance. Clara's blood turned to ice. She gripped the broom handle so tight her knuckles were white. Jack started to rise, his hand moving toward his gun. Easy, son, Brody said, his voice not unkind. I'm not here for a fight. I'm just here for a woman. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. The bounty. I'm looking for a Mrs. Clara Hale, runaway wife, wanted for theft and other matters. He looked directly at Clara. You fit the description. The porch was silent. The whole street seemed to be holding its breath. Clara started. You'll find no one by that name here. Sheriff. Widow Agnes had come to the door. She stood, her arms crossed, her small, frail body a sudden, immovable wall. This is Mrs. Carver, my guest. She and her husband have been here for 2 weeks. He's been recovering from a bullet wound. She's been nursing him. Brody looked at the widow, then back at Clara. Carver, you say? Funny. She looks just like the woman on this paper. And he nodded at Jack. Looks like a man who'd get a bullet wound. Preacher Hale says she was taken by a hired gun. Then Preacher Hale is a liar, Agnes said, her voice sharp. I've run this inn for 20 years. I know a good woman when I see one. I've seen no harlot. I've seen a wife tending to her husband. The doctor, who had been passing by, stopped. That's right. Sheriff, I stitched that man's side myself. A nasty graze. And his wife, Mrs. Carver, she's the one who pulled him through. A devoted woman. Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable. He was a man of the law, and the law was on the paper in his hand, but the town was against him. It was Clara who moved. She dropped the broom. She stepped away from the wall, away from Jack's protection, and walked to the center of the porch. She stood in front of the sheriff. My name was Clara Hale, she said, her voice clear and strong. It carried in the quiet street. I was married to Preacher Hale. He was not a man of God. He was a man of violence. A gasp went up from the few townsfolk who had gathered. He beat me, she said, her voice gaining power. He locked me in the dark. I ran to save my life. That is my only crime. She turned and pointed to Jack, who was standing now, his hand on her back, his face a silent, steady promise. This man found me in the desert, dying from a snake bite. He saved my life, and when my husband came, he came with guns. He shot this man. We fought to survive. We ran. She turned back to the sheriff. Her eyes were not pleading. They were a challenge. I stole nothing. I corrupted no one. I am a woman who ran from a monster. If that is a crime, then take me. Sheriff Brody stood there, the bounty paper in his hand. He looked at Clara, at her defiant, honest, terrified face. He looked at Jack, a man who was clearly ready to die, or to kill, for her. He looked at the hard, unforgiving eyes of Widow Agnes. He looked at the paper. A $50 lie, signed by a man known for his righteousness. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West, and he knew the difference between paper and truth. He let out a long sigh. He looked down at the bounty paper, then, slowly, deliberately, he tore it in half. He tore the halves into quarters. He let the pieces of paper fall from his hand, scattering in the dust of the street. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gruff, touching the brim of his hat to her. "As far as I'm concerned, I rode all this way, and I couldn't find the woman you're talking about." He looked at the paper scraps in the dust. There ain't no crime in surviving. He turned, mounted a horse, and rode back down the street, never once looking back. Clara let out a breath she felt she'd been holding her entire life. Her legs gave out, and she slumped against Jack, who held her up. He was shaking, or maybe she was. They were, for the first time, truly, finally, free. Later that night, the air was cold and sharp, the sky a vast spill of diamond-hard stars. The town was quiet. In their room, Clara, by the light of a single lamp, put on her new dress. The blue calico fabric was soft, the fit perfect. She felt whole. She felt like herself. Jack was watching her. He was dressed, his gun belt on. Their saddlebags were packed by the door. It's a good dress. "Clara," he said, his voice thick. "It's my dress," she said, and she smiled. They walked out under the stars, away from the inn, to the edge of the cottonwood grove. The wind was cold, sharp with the promise of winter. He turned to her. He looked at her, in her new dress, her face pale in the starlight. He reached out, his hand touching the new fabric at her shoulder. Then, his fingers moved up, to her neck, tracing the line of her collarbone. He leaned in and kissed her, softly, tenderly. The same place he had kissed her that first night, on her bare neck. A kiss of reverence. A tear slid down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "You set me free," she whispered. He pulled back, just enough to look her in the eyes. His scarred, beautiful face was serious, his gaze steady. "No," he replied, his voice a low, rough rumble. "You did that yourself. All I did, I just pulled it down." The story ends the next morning. They rode out of town at dawn. 2 horses, 2 riders, their supplies fresh. They're past a pile of torn paper in the dust. They rode north, toward the promise of Wyoming, toward the clean, hard land of their future. They did not look back. As they cleared the shelter of the grove, a cold wind hit them, and the first delicate snowflakes of the season began to fall. The snow was a benediction, a clean slate, covering their tracks, covering the past. They were 2 survivors, riding side by side, choosing a life not because it would be easy, but because, at last, it was finally theirs. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment and let us know. For more tales, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West, and we hope you'll share your thoughts on Clara and Jack's journey.